Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we ended with the Revolution of 1800. That term comes from Thomas Jefferson line, referring to the transition of power between kind of the Federalist understanding of government versus the Democratic Republican, Jeffersonian Democratic Republican, Jeffersonian Republican, whatever you want to call it, and their transition, their understanding of power. Today we're going to pick up the storyline with the Jefferson presidency and take us to the next couple of presidents in these early days of the Republic. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 3, identify the achievements and failures of Jefferson's presidency. Number 4, characterize the leadership and character of Vice President Aaron Burr. Number 5, explain the domestic and international conflicts of the 19th century. And number 6, analyze the origins, conduct, and conclusion of the War of 1812. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 3. When Jefferson took power, it signified a change in leadership. Now, specifically a change in leaders, but also a change in leadership style and philosophies of the government. Jefferson's inaugural address seemed to be conciliatory towards his opponents. He said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." However, despite his lofty rhetoric, and this is kind of a classic Jefferson move, but despite his lofty rhetoric, he worked pretty quickly to dismantle as much of the Federalist system as possible. He pardoned all of those people that were imprisoned under the Sedition Act. He cut government employees, like he cut the number of employees. He wasn't like cutting government employees, but he cut government employees. He slashed the Army and the Navy. Same thing. He cut the number of people in the Army and Navy. But anyway, he slashed the Army and the Navy. He abolished all taxes except for tariffs, and he started paying off part of the national debt. It's a big change than what was the Federalist model of a large government and a large standing army and a big navy and managing a federal debt pretty carefully. Subpoint B. John Marshall was a strong believer in national supremacy, and he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He'd been appointed to that position by Adams. John Marshall wasn't the first Chief Justice. We actually look at John Jay for the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but John Marshall's the one that kind of invents the role and gives it to us. He was a strong believer in national supremacy. John Marshall is very much a Federalist. He established the court's power to review the laws of Congress and of the states, a power that wasn't actually given to him in the Constitution, but it's Marshall who establishes the story of judicial review. And it comes to us from a Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. That's a Supreme Court case worth knowing. There's hundreds and hundreds of Supreme Court cases, and most of them aren't going to be that significant into what is American history. But Marbury versus Madison, put a red pen in this one. It established the precedent of the court's power of judicial review relative to federal laws. See, what happened was that before leaving office, John Adams signed into law a judicial act which reorganized a number of the courts. It also appointed several judges, and this was really in the last little tiny bit of the Adams presidency. They became known as the Midnight Judges. It's just not like a totally fair line. They weren't appointed at the stroke of midnight just as he's leaving, but it wasn't far from it. But one of those people included William Marbury. The appointments became officials. All those judges got their jobs when the legal papers were delivered. So John Adams could say like, hey, I'm going to name you a judge, but until he actually gets the document, he's not named a judge. So he appointed all these judges, but James Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. And one of the jobs of the Secretary of State in the 1800s was that he would go and carry out all of these appointments, naming all these positions. And Madison he's no longer in the Federalist camp. He helped write the Federalist Papers and he helped conceive the Constitution, but Madison is very much a member of the Jeffersonian Democrats. And he looked at these big stacks of papers and he says, well, why would I appoint all of these judges? These judges are going to be Federalist judges. They're clearly not the people I want to support. And so he might have gotten directions from Jefferson. The historical record's a little unclear to me, but whatever it was, Madison refused to go deliver those papers. So William Marbury said, well, I'm rightly appointed the Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C., and I should deserve that courtship, and I was validly appointed by a president, and I just haven't received the paper yet because the next guy won't give it to me. So Marbury sued Madison, and he petitioned the Supreme Court to issue a specific court order known as a writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is a court order. Basically, he asked the Supreme Court to issue a court order to say, Madison, go deliver those papers, to go demand that he deliver the commissions. And so they go and they take this to the Supreme Court. And this, honestly, this was a challenge for the Supreme Court. And it was kind of a dilemma for them to go face. Because if the court issued a writ of mandamus, then Jefferson could simply ignore it. If we understand our conception of the separation of powers, the person in charge of actually executing the laws, of carrying out the laws, is the president. And the court can say, hey, you have a court order to go do this, but who's going to make the president go do so? That's actually beyond the ability of the courts to do so. So they could issue whatever orders they want, but it would be up to the executive branch to enforce the own rules against themselves. And I strongly believe the Supreme Court would lose in that battle. But if, on the other hand, the Supreme Court refused to issue that writ of mandamus, if they said that, no, that we're not going to go issue a law, that issue a court order that we can't go carry out, it would appear that the entire third branch of government, the judicial branch, had just backed down and wilted before a big, strong executive, before the second branch of government. And John Marshall said, no, that's very much not the Marshall approach, because he wants a strong central government. So he's like, so there's a little bit of a pickle. They could either issue an order that won't get carried out, or they can refuse to issue the order and then look like they're just a patsy to one of the other branches of government. So John Marshall, and this is brilliant, it's kind of classic John Marshall, he reduced this case down to 3 questions. He says, first, does Marbury have a right to the commission? 2, if he has the right to the commission, and his right had been violated, did the law provide him some remedy to go fix the law? And number 3, if it did, would the proper remedy be a writ of mandamus issued by the Supreme Court? And so Marshall takes this big complex decision and he basically says, respectively, yes, yes, and no. Yes, he has the right to a commission. Yes, his right had been violated and he should go seek a remedy. But 3, no, the proper thing is not to go get a writ of mandamus at the Supreme Court. Now, technically, the law did allow that. In those judicial acts, in those several judicial acts that were being established by Congress, in those judicial acts, the law did allow the Supreme Court of the United States to issue a writ of mandamus. However, Marshall, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Marshall decided that the Judiciary Act, which would have allowed it, was actually a violation of the Constitution. And so he struck down the Judiciary Act that would have allowed him to issue a writ of mandamus. This is an interesting dilemma for the Supreme Court, because in the short term, and if all we're looking at is the short term, and politicians tend to look at the short term, but if all you're looking at the short term, it looks like John Marshall has just said, I'm sorry, the third branch of government is powerless. They gave us power and we just can't use it. It looks like the Supreme Court is giving in on this. However, in the long game, it's a totally different story. What you actually find out is that John Marshall, by taking also a piece that's not in the Constitution, making this act that says the Supreme Court is eliminating a law which had been issued by Congress and signed by the president, because he's saying that law wasn't constitutional and so I'm powerless to do anything about it. What he's actually doing is creating a huge power for the Supreme Court to go act on. That's an amazing move by John Marshall, and it's this huge power that was seized by the court. Subpoint C. As president, Jefferson was also expanding the powers of the government. Well, this is an interesting position for Jefferson, and it's classic Jefferson. While he's out there talking about small government, not a big, powerful government, he also takes the opportunity to increase the flow of settlers to the West, which is also not constitutional. But Republicans passed law where reducing the minimum acres were allowed for purchase. That would be the smaller farms, which is kind of in the Jeffersonian ideal of the small agrarian farmer. But he's reducing the minimum acres that were available to purchase. But then, in 1801, Jefferson is still a newly minted president. In 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte, so Emperor of France, gets in kind of a financial pickle and needs to get some money. And so Napoleon Bonaparte coerced Spain into seceding their lands in North America back to France. Spain picked up a whole bunch of land after the French and Indian War, basically, as France was pushed out of the continent altogether. A lot of that land was turned over to Spain for control, and Napoleon, through whatever means, coerces Spain into taking all of that American land, which they can't really use anyway in North America, and giving it back to the French, who had it before the Spanish did. Then he directed the Spanish officials to go restrict American access to New Orleans and saying, listen, well, this is going to be a French city again. You're going to keep the Americans out of New Orleans. to avoid hostilities with France. To go, like, Jefferson says, well, I want to go pick a war with France, and I'm not going to pick a war with Bonaparte. So in order to avoid hostilities with France, Jefferson instructed the American minister in Paris, a guy named Robert Livingston, to negotiate the purchase in New Orleans. Said, okay, well, if you don't want us in French territory, that's kind of an important city for us. How about we just go buy the city from you, and that'll just be an American city to go purchase New Orleans. And in April of 1803, Bonaparte and James Monroe concluded what became known as Louisiana Purchase for about $15 million. $15 million in 1803 dollars, with about $500 million today. That's a lot of money, but that's a lot of land that came with it. The Constitution didn't actually provide a way for Jefferson to go do this. It's an extra constitutional move by the president. But Jefferson made an exception, in a kind of classic move, to his typically strict constructionist principles. Subpoint D. In 1804, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis was a captain in the Army. Clark was referred to as a captain at the time, on an expedition to go gather information about this new purchase. They went into the topography of the land, the animals, the plants, and the people in Louisiana. And they traveled 1,000 miles on the Missouri River. And the expedition spent, the years of 1804 to 1805 among Indians, the winter between the Mandan and the Hidatsa people. They were farming increasingly. These were farming tribes. The Mandan and the Hidatsa people were farming tribes. And the Sioux were getting increasingly powerful. The Sioux Indians were militarizing. They were also getting guns from the French settlers, of the Americans that were going in there. And so they were under threat from the Sioux, and so the Mandan and the Hidatsas were excited to go meet what appeared to be a new tribe, right? The new American tribes, and to go join with those power. And they led Lewis and Clark led a 1,300-mile trek to the Pacific Ocean, and they ventured far beyond what was the Louisiana Purchase. They encountered a number of Native American tribes along the way, and all those Native American tribes were eager to get guns to go protect themselves from other armed tribes. We're seeing the militarization of the arming of the West here, which Lewis and Clark didn't escalate, but they participated in because everybody was participating in it. Their 1804 to 1806 journey brought all kinds of valuable information. It paved the way for truly a transcontinental country. They failed to find a water route to Asia, but they demonstrated the possibility of overland travel to the Pacific, and they inspired predictions of spanning the continent. Their goal was to go find a water route all the way to the Pacific, and that doesn't actually exist, but they found a pretty good long route. The Missouri River system is the longest river in North America. I mean, we would think that the Mississippi River is the longest river in North America, but actually the Missouri, the way it networks in, is the largest river in North America, and Lewis and Clark go and really map it out for us and provide the map. They don't quite get to the Pacific, but they get awful close to the Pacific. So that point, subpoint E. European wars directly influenced the livelihood of American farmers and merchants and artisans, and Jefferson hoped to avoid foreign entanglements. This is an interesting position because while Washington goes and proposes the Jay Treaty to keep Americans out of foreign entanglements, Jefferson's like, oh no, the Great Jay Treaty is bad because now you're not supporting our allies. And then when Jefferson becomes president, he takes a very similar approach to go stay out of European and foreign entanglements. Jefferson's first foreign policy, though, was a challenge to the Barbary pirates in North Africa. So North Africa settled, and they've got, they're raiding in and out of the Mediterranean there. And Americans are trying to do business in Europe. We're sending our ships through there. And they're not only in the Mediterranean, they're kind of, reaching into the Atlantic, sort of. But anyway, American shipping gets disrupted by the pirates of North Africa, known as the Barbary pirates. And so they're demanding bribes from American ships to go do business for there. Refusing to pay bribes, though, Jefferson basically says he engaged the United States in a 4-year conflict against these extortionists. It's not a war because they're not fighting a single foreign power, but they're fighting all of these networks of Barbary pirates in the Pacific. And after a 4-year conflict known as the Barbary War, they end up just lowering the extortion payments. There were continued attacks, and we don't really achieve any significant peace out of it. But it was a couple of things there. One, it shows that Jefferson, while he doesn't want to get involved in foreign affairs, he's not terribly opposed to going and defending American interests. And then second, it becomes the United States' first encounter with the Islamic world, because North Africa was traditionally an Islamic country. Roman numeral number 4. So when Jefferson becomes president, he gets in that long tangle with John Adams and Aaron Burr in 1800. And Burr had always been a Federalist, but he switched to the Democratic Republicans in 1800. Basically, the Southerners, trying to put Jefferson up to it, thought that Burr could come bring in New York with a voting bloc, and so it was an appealing decision. So they got into that long tangle that ended up with Jefferson winning and Burr getting vice president. And there was this, even though they were supposed to be on the same team, the election soured the relationship between Jefferson and Burr. And by 1804, the Constitution had been amended. The 11th and 12th amendment had been proposed, and the 12th amendment, the important one, it's the one that goes and reorganizes so the electoral college is going to vote. And Burr knew that he was not going to get reelected again. Like, Burr was off the ticket and wouldn't go be vice president. So he returned to New York, and he moved back to New York, and there he ran for governor of New York because he's a New Yorker and he expected to win it. But he actually lost. He lost the election in 1804 for governor of New York, and he lost it by a pretty major amount. Burr was a Democratic Republican, but he was supported by some important Federalists. They thought that he'd help lead, now this is a confusing story and stay with me, they thought that Burr would go lead a rebellion known as the Essex Junto. The Essex Junto was a plot for New York to go lead a New England secessionist plot to go split off from the rest of the United States. There was no Federalist in the race for New York governor in 1804. They were two Democratic Republicans that faced off against each other. Though he was once asked to lead the plot, Alexander Hamilton opposed the idea of the Essex Junto. He campaigned against Burr for governor in 1904 as well. We kind of know the story where he supports Jefferson over Burr in the 1800 presidential election, but he reprises the role and opposes Burr in the 1804 election as well. And he accuses Burr of trying to destroy the Union. Burr blamed Hamilton for the loss, and there was, they had been rivals, and maybe the better word is frenemies, but they had been rivals for decades. But at this point, Burr felt like Hamilton had always been stymieing his career. Felt like that Hamilton was getting all the important military positions during the War of the Revolution. And it turns out that he thought that he should have been named in the Washington cabinet. And then he turns around and he accuses Hamilton of, spoiling his bid to the presidency. And whether in military or politics, he finally had enough of Hamilton's meddling, and Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. Subpoint B. Dueling was not uncommon, but it was illegal, even in New Jersey. But it came with a gentlemanly code of behavior known as the Code Duello. Duels existed to settle a challenge of honor. It was never to settle a thing like a legal issue. It was always like, you insulted me, and you go stand up for your position. It was always a matter of honor. And if a person felt insulted, he could challenge the other person to the duel. So like if one person challenges the other person in the duel, the other person has been the challenger. At that point, the offending person could issue an apology. So Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, and if Hamilton would have said, "You're right, I'm sorry, I've been a jerk to you," and he issued an apology, then they wouldn't have to go to a duel. It would be settled. The challenger, would have gotten his challenge satisfied. So the whole thing would be over. The challenger would win without ever escalating the situation. But even if he refused to apologize, it doesn't immediately mean that it's going to escalate to a fight. Now, if you know the two men of Burr and Hamilton, you know that Hamilton just does not back down from challenges. If he's issued to say, like, hey, you need to do an apology, he would get his dander all up. He's like, no, you need to apologize. And they would get over the top of each other. So even if he refused to apologize, though, it didn't mean they would escalate to a fight. Each person would name somebody else to be their second, like to be the person that would negotiate on their behalf. They would negotiate an apology. And maybe Hamilton could have named a second, and the second could have apologized. That lets both sides kind of save face, because that lets the challenger go and say, I've been challenged, but I got an apology kind of indirectly, and that would allow Hamilton to go say, like, yeah, I've never apologized to him. Somebody did it on my behalf, but that wasn't my apology, and both sides could kind of save face on it. And a lot of duel challenges ended here. This was actually, you could challenge a person to a duel, and it would never escalate, because it would more or less end here. So, and a lot of duel challenges end here. Both sides accepted the terms of the duel, so they both saved their honor, and the second men with cooler heads negotiated an apology, and both would save face. That's kind of like best case scenario that would come out of it. But if the seconds couldn't reach an agreement, if those two deputies couldn't reach an agreement, the challenge would become a fight. And the person who was challenged could go and choose the weapons. So in this case, Burr challenged Hamilton. Hamilton accepted the duel, and it's his job to go choose the weapons to it. And typically what you have are knives, swords, and guns. The two men, they wouldn't attack at the same time. When you see dueling happens and they both turn and fire, that's actually not the way it would work, particularly with pistol fire. They would take gentlemanly turns. This is a gentlemanly question of honor, so they would take turns, and each one would fire in position back and forth. And the second would cast lots. Basically, they would go roll dice to go see who would attack first and from what position. Subpoint C. Generally, duels were settled with pistols or swords. Now, it's worth noting that pistols of the era were notoriously inaccurate. It was early technology of pistols, and smooth bores, which means the barrel of the gun is just a hollow pipe. There's no, later we get to the Civil War, they'll invent rifling, which cuts grooves along through the pipes, but this was just smooth bar pistols, and the bullet is a ball, and they're just notoriously inaccurate. There's short barrels, and a person could actually aim straight at and fire and exactly miss them because the guns were just notoriously inaccurate. So you could actually, the safest way to accept a duel was to go choose pistols because you didn't really know where that was going to go anyway. Hamilton won the rights. Castiglione wanted the first attack, and he chose pistols. This might have been because he intended to what's referred to as throwing away his shot, or basically to go fire into the. I'm out of the camera. Go fire into the air to the ground. That is another way to save honor. So here you have the first person that's shooting. They can go throw away the shot. That means they've accepted the duel. They refused to apologize. They stood there on the field and they fired first. But even they fired in a gentlemanly way that they go and shot, but didn't go and actually shoot towards the other person. They could just go, point up wherever it would be. Throwing away a shot. That would allow Hamilton to save face in a totally manly way. He'd made his insult. He'd refused to apologize. He accepted the terms of the challenge, but he also refused to kill the other person. On the other hand, this is also worth noting, Hamilton chose pistols, and he chose a particular type of pistols that were trick pistols that had a hidden trigger that would actually fire a second shot that was like hidden in the gun if it was activated. And so if he was shot at, he could go fire back quickly, and if he had to do so, he could do that. So you have Hamilton kind of taking both positions on this way. He appears to, and in some of his papers, he wrote that he was planning on throwing away a shot, but on the other hand, he picked weapons that would allow him to change his mind in a heartbeat. Subpoint D, Hamilton fired his first shot into the air, and he missed a branch over Burr's head. So he fires in the direction of Burr, but not at Burr. He doesn't fire at him, he fires in the direction of him. But and this part is murky, and historians have had a hard time putting it back together, but this is the conventional understanding of it. The bullet goes over Burr's head, he hears it, and it hits some branch near him, and he sees like leaves falling down at him. And Burr is like, God, I thought we were going to throw away the shot. So he turns and just level fires straight in at Hamilton. So he, in this case, maybe spooked with the falling leaves, he leveled his pistol and fired right at Hamilton. According to the Code Duello, Burr was totally justified in his shot. According to the Code of Honor and Gentlemanly Behavior, he was absolutely justified in his shot. And Hamilton was struck in the torso and was mortally wounded. Subpoint E. When the rest of the story goes that the public was outraged. When they both returned back to New York, Burr fled to New York and eventually New Jersey, and eventually had to go all the way down south to Washington, D.C. in an effort to go escape from the capture. He completed his vice presidential term safe from prosecution. The indictments that reached the case never went to trial. So he's a sitting vice president, just killed a man on the dueling field, and then goes back and just escapes from the law by being vice president and pretty much gets away with it. But it was essentially the end of Burr's political career. He began this unconventional plans to rise to power, including a plan to go establish a new country out of the Louisiana Territory. This is a great subplot out of Burr, where basically he arranges this deal from Spain, and Spain gave to Aaron Burr a lease of 40,000 acres in the Texas territory. And while he's there, Burr had planned on arranging this cabal of U.S. planters and politicians and army officials, and they were going to then split off from the Spanish territory in Texas and establish an independent country in the southwestern corner of the country and parts of Mexico. This plan was leaked to Jefferson, and they said, no, that would include parts that are the Louisiana Territory. And then so the plan was leaked to Jefferson, and Jefferson's like, so you're planning on leading a secessionist plot in a sleepy corner of the country? No, that sounds like grounds for treason, and so he ordered his arrest and trial for treason. Burr was acquitted of all of those charges as well, but his reputation was even further damaged, and he spent the rest of his life basically had to leave the country in political ruins and go move to Europe. He finally returned to New York City in 1812. There the controversy had died down. Burr had resumed his law practice and then more or less spent the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, having disappeared from the public eye. Fascinating story of Aaron Burr. He's the other side of the Hamilton drama that most people don't know much about. Roman numeral number 5. As the Napoleonic Wars were raging through Europe, Britain and France refused to respect the neutrality of American merchant vessels. Napoleon's customs officials were seizing American ships that were stopping into Britain. So we have American shipping ships, that's weird to say, but they're going up into Britain, and along the way, the French are seizing them. Napoleon's ships are seizing these American ships, and they're like, hey, we're fighting war with Britain. You can't go do business with Britain. The British stopped American ships going into Europe as well. And America's like, hey, we're not in your war. We're just trying to do business here. And so American ships are going into Europe, which is Napoleon territory, and the British are going and capturing them there as well. And so they were searching them for British deserters, and then were forced back into the Royal Navy. Jefferson devised a law in 1807 known as the Embargo Act, which would prohibit American ships from leaving their home ports until Britain and France agreed to repeal restrictions on American trade. The goal was to say, listen, Britain and France, you guys are capturing our ships. We're just not going to do business with you. If you want American goods, then you have to stop it. And so, like, we're just going to put an embargo on you and not do any business because you are really bad for American shipping. But the problem is that Britain and France didn't actually need American ships as much as Americans needed foreign markets to go do business with. And his mismanagement of the trade embargo ended up hurting the American economy, and it caused American exports to plunge, and it didn't really suffer any effects toward Britain and France. By the time that Jefferson leaves office in 1908, he really walks out with a pretty tarnished reputation. He looks like a guy that is mismanaging the rest of the world. He's getting American ships captured or raided by Barbary pirates. And it looks like, he spent all that time cutting down the Army and the Navy, so we can't really defend ourselves there. And there's a secessionist plot during his presidency that happens to be run by his vice president. And when Jefferson leaves office, everyone's like, dude, Jefferson, what, man? You're a terrible president. Subpoint B. In 1908, James Madison won office. Now, Madison had been Jefferson's right-hand man and was ultimately his his hand-picked successor. While the public was pretty much sick of Jefferson, the Electoral College, which is where, the insider politics power worked, Jefferson more or less said to the Democratic Republicans, I need you to pick James Madison as the successor, and they do so. Madison replaced that failed embargo with new economic restrictions, none of which was any more successful than persuading Britain and France to respect America's neutrality rights, but it did allow American trade to resume. It warned, however, the Madison approach that said, if either country interferes with American right to trade, then we're going to go resume that embargo, which for me sounds like a pretty empty threat. Instead, congressmen at the time, and there's another branch of government over here, they've got the Congress branch, and they're saying, you have all these congressmen, and they become known as a group known as the War Hawks. The War Hawks would include Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Remember those names that were going to be really important later. And they called for war against Britain. They said, no. If you want to go respect American shipping rights, you don't negotiate a deal that they don't care about. Let's go get our ships and go sail over there and go declare war against Great Britain. And then, while we're at it, let's annex Canada. And maybe we'll go take Florida. This is the War Hawks' proposal, the way for dealing with the rest of the world. And so, Madison's dealing with what looks like these, saber-rattling clamors for war at the same time. Subpoint C. Indian relations were breaking down in the West. We have all these new settlers moving into the Louisiana Territory and the Trans-Appalachian West. And Jefferson tried to basically say, all these Native Americans that we're going to run into, if they would just assimilate into proper white American life, then we won't have conflicts with them. And then Jefferson tried to move non-assimilated Native Americans to territory west of the Mississippi River and said, Trans-Appalachian West, just keep moving west, get on the other side of the Mississippi, and then there you'll be free from American meddling as well. Nearly 400,000 Americans were living west of the Appalachian Mountains. It far outnumbered the Native Americans that were there. Indian opinions were pretty much split. Do they give in and assimilate into American life, or do they reject it and retain their autonomy? Here I want to introduce Chief Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. They were both Shawnee Indians, and they both tried to revive a pan-Indian movement, basically uniting different tribes and different people to go unite against white Americans. At a settlement known as Prophettown in Indiana, Tecumseh called for attacks on the American frontier settlements in 1810. And following a series of clashes between 1810 and November of 1811 between settlers in this Western Confederacy, William Henry Harrison was the governor of the Indiana Territory, and William Henry Harrison led an army against Tenskwatawa's village of Prophetstown. When he did so, he fended off the Western Confederacy's warrior at the battle, the warriors, the group of the Western Confederacy, what's known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. And his victory was so lopsided, he burns the village to the ground, and William Henry Harrison walks out with a reputation as like, this guy is an Indian fighter and a guy that gets things done. And they even give him the name of his most important battle. William Henry Harrison becomes known as Old Tippecanoe because he's the victor of the battle of Tippecanoe against Tenskwatawa and Chief Tecumseh. Roman numeral number 4. In 1795, James Madison had been against wars. In 1795, he was against wars altogether. He wrote that the war is the parent of armies, and armies bring debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the law. But John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, those though are war hawks, they hope to gain new territory, and they hope to discredit the Federalists. And they're Democratic Republicans. They're in Madison's party, and they were constantly urging war against Great Britain. And with the elections approaching, Madison demanded the British respect for American sovereignty in the West and American neutrality rights in the Atlantic. And the British are like, whatever, Americans, you are small potatoes to us. And the British didn't respond, and he asked Congress, and he says, okay, listen, if they're not going to listen to us here, and they're like, put up these war hawks in Congress, let's get a declaration of war. And so in June of 1812, a sharply divided Senate voted 19-13 for war. The House of Representatives representatives concurred. They voted for war 79 to 49. Although the United States officially entered a war with Great Britain to go protect the commercial rights of a neutral nation, the 1812 election campaign also revealed that the war, the reason for the war was the protection of Western interests. Subpoint B. The government found it very difficult to finance this brand new war, which I think in most historians' opinion was a pretty unnecessary war. And then they go and they have a hard time actually paying for it. Partly because the charter of the Bank of the United States, the thing that was originally proposed by Alexander Hamilton, was expiring and the bank would be closed. Now, technically, it didn't kill the bank, but Madison always opposed the project and didn't want to go and revive it. And so northern banks were reluctant to go lend the country money, and so they ask for a declaration of war, and then suddenly they can't go put up money to go fight in this brand new war that they probably an unnecessary war that they called. So they're fighting in what becomes known as the War of 1812. Always a little cash strapped to get into the business of it. Subpoint C. At first, the British were mostly preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Basically, we get into the War of 1812, and Great Britain is like, what? In the West? Who cares? We've got actual war in Europe fighting Napoleon. It's a much bigger threat, much more present to our country. So at first, the British were preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars, but they still were able to go send their troops into the Canadian territory and put down 2 American invasions of Canada. And then Britain defeats Napoleon. When they defeat Napoleon, they turn all of their efforts back over to North America. The British invaded Washington, D.C. They burned the White House down. The White House totally torched, burned down to an empty shell. Not much remained after the attack. There was famously a portrait of George Washington that was saved at the order of Dolly Madison, the First Lady of the United States, and she demanded that people go back into the burning mansion and go grab it. And it's this really dramatic scene where they go in you must save the Washington portrait. So they're running in, and there's boards falling down. It's like a movie scene, right? They're running into the burning blaze, and they go and they pull down the Washington portrait, and it's stuck to the wall, and they're like, what? Oh no, it's stuck. And they got to pull out their pocket knives and cut it off the wall, and they roll it up like a carpet, and they're running out, and the building's falling down behind them the whole time. And it turns out that is the Washington portrait. It's the one that everybody knows when they think about George Washington. And Dolly Madison, she was right to go save it. It's awesome. It's the most important painting in maybe in American history. We credit, it's hard to say that Dolly Madison gets the credit for it. It's the unknown people that had to go run back into the burning. They're the ones that should get the credit, but it's pretty awesome that it was saved. The Indian tribes siding with the British in the War of 1812, they were defeated in the Midwest area and in the South. In January of 1815, Andrew Jackson actually achieved the war's greatest victory. He was a colonel fighting in the Southern Front during the War of 1812, and there he's fighting off the British in New Orleans. As the British are coming up the port, technically, strictly speaking, the war has actually been over by this point. We'd signed the treaty of it, but that hadn't reached down to the battle. So anyway, you've got the British advancing into New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson goes, and Colonel Jackson goes and rallies and puts down this rebellion in the Battle of New Orleans, and it's really the war's greatest victory. And that allows Americans to do a couple of things. Really, the War of 1812 was more or less a stalemate that we were going to negotiate the end to of a war that we didn't really need to get into. We didn't exactly win, but we won the last battle of the war, and so Americans walk out of the War of 1812 saying yeah, we won the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was actually a near disaster for Americans, both militarily and politically. Political divisions in the United States, they prevented a major invasion of Canada from the east. New Englanders opposed the war. Boston merchants, they said, no, we're not going to lend money to the government because we're against this war to begin with. And after 2 years of sporadic warfare, the United States made little progress along the Canadian frontier, and they were on the defensive and on the Atlantic. Moreover, the new capital city of Washington, D.C. was in ruins, and the presidential mansion had been burned down, and a British blockade was threatening the nation's economy. And every time we turn around, something is more bad news in the War of 1812. In the Southwest, Andrew Jackson led an army of militiamen to victory over the British-supported Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 and forced the Indians to cede 23 million acres of land. The war continued to go badly. An American naval victory on Lake Champlain narrowly avoided a British invasion of the Hudson River Valley, and the British troops landed outside of New Orleans. They threatened to cut off American trade towards down the Mississippi River. Subpoint E. American military setbacks strengthened the opposition to the war. Fortunately for the young American Republic, Great Britain wanted peace. But when it came down to it, Great Britain was just not that interested in fighting this war in those ways. Britain wanted peace. They'd sat from a 20-year war from France, and this was an unimportant war to them in North America. So the war was settled by the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve of 1814, and it restored the pre-war borders of the United States. That didn't arrive until after the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson's victory against the Battle of New Orleans, it not only made Andrew Jackson a national hero, but it also redeemed the nation's pride and snapped some little victory out of the jaws of stalemate. The war confirmed the ability of the Republican government to conduct a war without surrendering the institutions or breaking down to chaos, and that's probably the real result of the War of 1812. It's really that we could go and wage a war against a major foreign power and not just totally fold. It was one of those moments like, our little country did it. All right, guys. Like, it was like, that's really the victory of the War of 1812. Not that we beat the British, but that we fought without collapsing into anarchy. It also brought the end of the Federalist Party in subpoint F. Madison was narrowly reelected in 1812 amidst the anti-war settlement, but Federalists faced their loss with the Hartford Convention. Basically, the Federalists lost in 1800, in 1804, in 1808, and in 1812. And they're just like, man, how many times are we going to lose the White House? Well, it wasn't called the White House until after the War of 1812. That's when they burned it down, had to go repaint over the scar marks. Anyway, it was like, how long are we going to keep losing this presidency? And so they there at the Hartford Convention said, what are we going to do with the future of the Federalist Party? There they called for to basically limit Virginia's dominance. They said one of the things that gives the South so much power over the Northern interests and the Democratic Republicans over the Federalist Party was that 3/5 clause that's artificially inflating the power of the House by counting for population purposes slaves, which they turn around and deny the right to citizenship to. And so they said they should eliminate the 3/5 clause. And they also wanted to go change the declaration of war from a simple majority to a 2/3 vote of Congress, and to say that the right of a state to interpose its authority with regard to federal law would be firmly unconstitutional because you have people in the South arguing for a nullification issue. And remember that word, we'll get to it later. Jackson's victory, though, basically when Jackson wins, everybody's like, we won the War of 1812! And that like boosts morale of the Democratic Republican Party, and with a few years the Federalist Party entirely disappeared. However, the Federalists raised an important issue. That was the Southern domination of government. That would long outlive their party, and it would be one of those things that the Southerners would always more or less struggle with the Northerners. And there's this question of like slave and free and agriculture and industry, and it comes down to what's the reputation of the party. And all of this is a tremendously fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.